welcome back. Let yourself grow still and let the day quietly slip away. Together, we'll drift toward the dark, still waters, hiding a lost ship of gold. If these carry you off to sleep, subscribe. A new one comes every night. A man is pressing his palm against the side of a ship. The shipyard is in Havana. The year is somewhere in the 17th century, in the long middle span of the Spanish Empire's Atlantic operations, when the machinery of treasure transport had settled into its most elaborate and codified form. The morning air carries pine tar and salt, and the smell of the sea is close, the harbor only a short walk through the yard's open gate, the water visible between the buildings when the wind shifts. The man pressing his hand to the planking is not a carpenter, and he is not the captain. He is a royal inspector, a vidor, and the gesture he makes is professional and precise. The heel of his hand against the seam between two strakes, pressing to test the resistance of the caulking beneath, checking whether the oakum and pitch packed between the planks will hold under the pressure of deep water. He moves slowly. He has done this before. He carries a lantern in his other hand, but held low and close to the hull, so the light rakes across the surface and reveals any irregularity in the planking, any swelling where moisture has already worked its way into the wood, any shadow along a seam that suggests the caulking sits proud rather than flush. The hull he is inspecting is a galleon, not the romantic object of later imagination, not an icon, not a symbol, but a specific working vessel, recently completed, smelling of fresh pitch and raw timber and the particular resinous warmth of Cuban cedar, drying slowly in tropical heat. It is a large ship, though not the largest, that the shipyards of the Spanish Atlantic produced in this period. Its proportions conform to the guidelines established in the treatise that Diego Garcia de Palacio published in 1587, a document that standardized the dimensional relationships between a galleon's keel, beam, and depth of hold, the ratios that determined how much cargo the ship could carry, how it would behave under sail in Atlantic weather, how deep it would sit when fully loaded. A galleon built to these proportions is not an improvisation. It is a calculated object, the product of a formal theory about how a ship should be shaped to accomplish a specific commercial and imperial task. The vidor sets his lantern down on a timber at his feet and opens his inspection ledger. The pages are already marked from previous ships, columns of observations, small notations about caulking quality, about the fit of the rudder assembly, about the diameter of the pumping wells measured against the required standard. For this ship, the record will run to several pages before the inspection is complete. Every hull seam on every accessible face of the planking below the waterline must be checked and recorded. Every fastening, the iron spikes and wooden treenails that hold the strakes against the frames, must be examined for any sign that the wood has split around the fastener or that the iron has already begun to rust and swell in the tropical moisture. This is not a cursory process. The document the vidor is building has legal force. His signature on the completed inspection record is a statement, under royal authority, that this ship is fit to carry the crown's cargo. The frames the planking covers were cut from tropical hardwoods, some of them Cuban cedar, some of them mahogany, sourced from the same island's interior forests. The Spanish shipbuilding tradition had expanded into the Caribbean, partly because the hardwoods available there offered a specific advantage that Iberian timber could not match: resistance to the marine borers that destroyed northern European wood in warm Atlantic water. The teredo worm, a bivalve that tunnels through submerged timber and reduces it in time to a fragile shell that retains its shape while being hollow within, was a persistent problem for ships built from the softer woods of northern forests and sent into tropical waters. Cuban cedar and tropical mahogany were harder, denser, and less hospitable to the borer's boring. A hull framed and planked in these materials might survive years in Caribbean waters, where an equivalent hull of European oak would be riddled within a season. The choice of timber was not aesthetic. It was strategic, and it was based on accumulated experience across generations of Atlantic crossings. The shipyard where this inspection is taking place has been building vessels for the transatlantic trade for decades. The workers who moved through it, the caulkers with their mallets and their hemp oakum, the frame cutters who worked the green timber into curved sections following patterns chalked onto the ground, the joiners who fitted the internal decking, had learned their trade from men who had learned it before them in an unbroken chain of practice that connected this Havana yard to the older shipbuilding traditions of the Cantabrian coast in northern Spain. The knowledge of how to build a vessel capable of surviving the North Atlantic in winter while carrying several hundred tons of cargo was not theoretical knowledge. It was practical and physical, passed from hand to hand and tested repeatedly against the actual behavior of actual ships in actual weather. The hull the Vidor is inspecting was built using carvel planking, strakes laid edge to edge against the internal frames, so that the outer face of the hull is smooth rather than overlapping. This was the standard for vessels of this size in the Spanish tradition, distinguished from the clinker construction used for smaller northern European craft, and it produced a hull surface that could be more easily caulked and more effectively sealed against water intrusion at depth. Each strake, each long horizontal run of plank, was fitted to its neighbor with care, the edges sometimes slightly beveled, so they met at a slight angle that the caulking could be driven into from outside with a caulking iron. The oakum was tarred hemp, teased into a loose rope, and then driven with iron tools into the seam until it sat compressed and dense between the planks. Over it, in the final stage of caulking, came the pitch, hot pine tar brushed or poured along the seam to seal the oakum against water and keep it from working loose when the planks flexed under stress. The Vidor finishes his examination of the lower port side and moves to the stern, where the rudder assembly hangs on its pintles and gudgeons, the interlocking iron fittings that allow the rudder to pivot while remaining fixed to the stern post. He checks the pintles by pressing against the rudder's upper edge, testing for play. There should be minimal movement. A rudder that shifts too freely in its fittings will wear the pintles fast in rough weather, and a ship that loses steering in a storm is a ship in serious danger. He notes the condition of the fittings in his ledger. He notes the condition of the tiller head. He notes the depth of the bottom of the rudder below the keel, checking that the lower fitting has been set to the correct depth and that the rudder extends far enough below the hull to be effective in the event the ship is running with reduced cargo and riding higher than loaded trim. All of this is written down. Everything is written down. The process that brings a ship into royal service for the treasure trade is a process that runs entirely through documents. The Vidor's inspection record is one layer of a deep bureaucratic structure whose center is not in Havana at all, but in Seville, in a stone building near the cathedral that houses the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, the institution established by the Spanish crown in 1503 to regulate, tax, inspect, and document every commercial transaction connected to the Americas. The Casa de Contratación maintained records of every licensed vessel, every authorized voyage, every cargo loaded and unloaded at every colonial port. It licensed pilots and captains, registered the training and certification of navigators, oversaw the payment of the Crown's 20% tax on all American treasure, and received and filed the manifests of every ship in the treasure fleet each time a fleet returned to Seville. Before any galleon designated to carry royal treasure could take on its cargo, the Casa de Contratación required that the ship pass the full inspection that the Vidor was now completing, and not merely pass it in general, but receive a royal cedula, a formal written document bearing the monarch's seal that named this specific ship and authorized it to carry the crown's consignment. The cedula was not a courtesy, it was a legal instrument. It named the captain, it described the ship, it specified the nature and estimated value of the cargo that would be loaded, and it bound the captain personally to the obligation of delivering that cargo intact to the designated port in Spain under penalty of death. The captain named in the cedula had typically served for many years in the Atlantic trade before receiving a command of this kind. The route from the American colonies to Spain was well known in the sense that it had been traveled hundreds of times, but it was not safe, and it was not forgiving of poor decisions. A captain who lost a treasure ship through negligence, who departed in the wrong season, who failed to maintain his vessel properly, who took risks that experienced mariners would have avoided, faced ruin in the mildest case, and execution in the worst. The royal cedula made the distribution of responsibility explicit. The captain was the crown's agent, the ship was the crown's instrument, the cargo was the crown's property, and the document on the table in Seville, with its wax seal and its careful ink, made all of that formal and binding and permanent. The cedula itself was a beautiful object, in the restrained way that important administrative documents of the period achieved beauty through formality and care. It was written on cream-colored paper, good paper, heavier than ordinary commercial stock, meant to survive the handling it would receive over the months of the voyage. The handwriting was a professional clerk's hand, the letters formed with the deliberate regularity of someone trained specifically in document production. The monarch's seal was pressed into wax of a deep red or dark brown, the mold cutting cleanly into the warm wax so that the emblem of the crown appeared in full relief at the bottom of the document, below the final line of text and above the signatures of the Casa de Contratación officials who countersigned it. The captain's name appeared near the top in a slightly larger hand, and the name of the ship appeared beside it. That document rested for a time on a table in the Casa de Contratación before it was delivered to the captain. It lay there in the particular stillness of a room used for official transactions, stone-floored, high-windowed, the light coming in from a courtyard, while the ink of the signatures dried and the wax of the seal cooled to its final hardness. Other documents rested near it. The registry of the ship's tonnage, certified by a separate official, the captain's license renewed for this voyage, the cargo manifest not yet filled in, the lines and columns waiting for the numbers that would be entered as the loading proceeded in the harbor. An entire paper architecture surrounding a ship that was at that moment floating in Caribbean water, its hull still smelling of fresh pitch, the Vidor's inspection completed and recorded. The ship that would carry royal treasure was, structurally, a more heavily armed vessel than the ordinary merchantmen that made up the bulk of the fleet. A treasure galleon required cannon, bronze guns, typically mounted on the gun deck behind closed ports in rows running along both sides of the ship's main structural level. The gun deck was accessed by a ladder from the upper deck, and in the dim light below, the cannon ports closed, the only illumination coming through gaps in the planking and from lanterns hung from the deck beams. The bronze muzzles of the guns rested in their wooden carriages, each carriage fitted with trucks, the thick wooden wheels that allowed the gun to roll back on recoil and be run out again through the port for the next shot. The guns were heavy. A large bronze cannon might weigh 2,000 pounds or more, and their placement on the ship was calculated carefully against the vessel's stability. Too many guns too high in the ship could compromise the vessel's righting moment, the force that brought it back upright after a roll in heavy seas. The placement of the battery was therefore a structural matter, as well as a tactical one. The gun ports ran in a line along both sides of the hull below the main deck level, each port a square opening cut through the planking and framing, fitted with a hinged wooden lid that could be swung up and out of the way when the gun was run out, and closed and secured when the ship was under sail in normal conditions. The lids were fitted with simple iron hardware, a hinge at the top, a latch at the bottom, and when closed they sat nearly flush with the hull surface, barely distinguishable from the planking around them, unless the light hit them at the right angle to reveal the seam. From a distance, from a pursuing vessel, or from a neutral ship, uncertain of the galleon's intentions, the closed ports might make the gun deck invisible entirely. The ship might appear to be an ordinary merchantman. The sealed ports were, in their way, a kind of document too, a formal concealment, a surface that told a story different from what lay behind it. The lower hold of the ship, the bodega, sat below all of this, below the gun deck, below the orlop, where ropes and spare gear were stored, down at the very bottom of the hull, where the bilge water collected, and the ship's movement in a seaway was felt most slowly. The bodega was where the heaviest cargo was carried, not only for reasons of capacity, but for reasons of stability. Heavy cargo carried low in the hold kept the ship's center of gravity low and contributed to the vessel's resistance to rolling. Gold was heavy, silver was heavy, chests of coin were heavy. The cargo of a treasure galleon was, from a naval architect's perspective, nearly ideal, dense, compact, and suited by its very nature to low stowage. The chests in the bodega were not simply piled in the available space. They were chained directly to the internal frames of the hull, iron links running from iron staples through the handles of the chests, and secured with locks so that even in extreme rolling or flooding the cargo would not shift. The separation of cargo by type and value was formalized and specific. The bodega held the bulk cargo, the gold and silver bars, the chests of coin, the heavier commercial consignments, but the most precious items and the items of particular royal or ecclesiastical significance were stored separately. Near the stern of the ship, in the section of the hull closest to the captain's own quarters, was a space that appears in various period documents under names that translate roughly as the Treasury Chamber, the Camera del Tesoro. This was a different kind of storage. The Camera del Tesoro was a small space, a low ceiling, barely enough for a man to stand fully upright. Walls that were the inner face of the ship's structural planking, sealed and fitted with iron fittings, rather than the rough finished surface of the working hold below. The floor was fitted with additional reinforcement, the frames beneath it doubled or trebled to provide a secure anchor for the iron bolts that held the chests to the floor. The chests themselves were bound with iron straps across their lids and around their sides, and the locks on each chest were multiple. A chest might have 2 or 3 separate locks, each keyed differently, so that opening it required the presence of 2 or 3 different officers, each carrying a different key. That distribution of keys was not incidental. It was a formal security arrangement specified in the rules governing the transport of royal treasure. No single person aboard the ship held all the keys. The captain might hold one. The ship accountant, the escribano, might hold another. A crown representative, traveling as a passenger, might hold a third. The arrangement meant that the Camera del Tesoro could not be accessed legitimately by any one individual acting alone. Opening it required a meeting, the physical assembly of the separate key holders, the formal unlocking of each lock in turn, and the witness of the escribano, who recorded in his own ledger every time the chamber was opened and what was removed or deposited. The chamber was lit, when it was used, by a single oil lamp hung from a beam above the center of the space. The lamp was a small bronze or iron fixture, the kind used throughout the ship in areas where a lantern could not be hung at height, and its flame was protected from drafts by a glass chimney. The lighted cast was warm and narrow, falling on the iron-banded chests in the center of the floor, on the walls of planking around them, on the low arch of the deck beam above. When the lamp was extinguished, and the door closed, and the locks engaged, the chamber was dark. The darkness in the stern of a ship at sea is a specific darkness, moving slightly, with the motion of the hull through the water, the boards creaking softly as the vessel works in a seaway, the sound of the sea audible through the planking, as a low and continuous rushing, punctuated by the deeper sounds of waves striking the hull and the regular groan of the steering gear as the helmsman above adjusted course. The Camera del Tesoro was bolted shut before departure. The keys were distributed. The escribano made his record. The loading of the hold was complete. The hatches battened down over the bodega, the deck cargo secured and lashed. The Vidor had signed his inspection record weeks before, and the royal cedula had been delivered to the captain and was now folded in his own locked chest in his cabin. The Casa de Contratacion's copy of the cargo manifest was filed in Seville. The duplicate register, sealed in its watertight container, was on its shelf in the captain's quarters. Everything that could be documented had been documented. Everything that could be locked had been locked. Everything that could be inspected had been inspected and recorded and signed. The ship floated in its harbor. The Camera del Tesoro sat in the dark of the stern, its iron locks engaged, its lamp extinguished, the keys held in 3 separate pairs of hands on 3 separate decks above and around it. Whatever was inside sat in stillness, the stillness of a room that has been prepared with great care for a specific purpose, that has been checked and rechecked and sealed, that holds within it the objects it was built to hold, waiting in the quiet below the waterline, while the harbor moved around the hull outside, while the sailors moved on the deck above, while the light changed over the water in the morning and the afternoon and the long tropical evening. It was a room that had been thought about and planned and constructed with exceptional precision, from the doubled frames beneath its floor to the iron of its door fittings, to the number and placement of its locks. Every aspect of it was the product of accumulated institutional knowledge about how to keep something safe across an ocean crossing, knowledge tested across generations, refined after losses, encoded, eventually in royal ordinances and construction treaties, and the professional practices of Vidors, who had spent their careers pressing their palms against caulked seams in Caribbean shipyards. The room waited. The keys were in their separate hands. The wax seal of the royal cedula had been pressed and had cooled, and was now hard and fixed in its impression on the document in the captain's chest. The ink of the inspection record had dried in the Vidor's ledger in Havana. The ship rested in the water with the particular depth of a fully loaded hull, its gunwale lower than it would be when running light, the harbor water a little higher against the black strakes of the hull than it would be mid-voyage, when provisions and water had been consumed and the ship had lightened slightly for the crossing. The Camera del Tesoro held its contents in the dark. The lantern was cold. The locks held. The iron-banded chests sat on their reinforced floor, bolted and latched and chained, in a room that had been built around them and sealed above them, and bolted shut behind anyone who entered. The room was close and low-ceilinged, and smelled of timber and pitch and the faint metallic trace of iron fittings. No sound came into it from the harbor. No light reached it from the sky. It was a room that existed, in a functional sense, entirely for the objects it contained, built for them, sealed for them, locked and distributed, and recorded for them, and in the dark of the hull, in the quiet of the stern below the captain's quarters, it simply was there, waiting, as it had been built to wait. The inspection was complete. The document was signed. The room held what it held, in the particular and careful dark of a hull prepared for the open Atlantic, everything locked and everything recorded and everything waiting for the moment the anchor chain would come up and the ship would begin to move. The ship itself, its curved cedar ribs, its caulked seams, its bronze guns and their closed ports, its bodega with its chained chests, its Camera del Tesoro with its 3 locks and its cold lamp, was an extraordinarily deliberate object. It was not built quickly. It was not built carelessly. From the moment the keel was laid in the shipyard, to the moment the Vidor pressed his palm for the last time against the sealed planking and made his final entry in his ledger, it had been the product of continuous, practiced, documented intention, every joint in its framing, every seam in its planking, every fastening in its hull, every lock on every chest in its locked room. The room sat in the dark of the lower stern, the iron bands of the chests faintly warm from the tropical air that had permeated the hull during the days of loading, the lamp cold and still on its ceiling beam, the locks engaged in their positions, the 3 keys carried separately in 3 pairs of hands somewhere above and around it on the decks of the waiting ship. It was a room that had been thought into existence with great care. It held what it held. The harbor moved outside the hull. The morning passed over Havana. The Camera del Tesoro waited in the dark, sealed and still and entirely ready, long before the voyage had begun. A gold bar lifts from a stone table in the light of a colonial assay house, carried in both hands by a man who has weighed it twice already this morning and will weigh it once more before he is satisfied. The bar is roughly the size of a thick book. It is warm from sitting near the lamp. Along its upper surface, pressed into the metal itself during the casting and certification process, there are marks, a sequence of stamped notations recording the weight in marcos, the fineness rating certified through fire testing, and the abbreviated name of the assay house that passed it. The man carries it to a waiting chest and sets it down with the particular care of someone who understands precisely what the object represents, not as a symbol of anything abstract, but as a documented quantity of refined metal whose exact properties have been formally established and recorded and will now be committed to a voyage across open water. The assay houses of the Spanish colonial world operated under direct crown authority, and the system they maintained was one of deliberate, unhurried precision. In Mexico City, in Lima, in the high Andean city of Potosí, where the silver mountains ran so deep that entire communities existed underground, the work of certification followed the same sequence, regardless of how large the shipment was or how long the fleet had been waiting. Raw bullion arrived from the mining operations, was assessed for impurity, subjected to the process called ensay, fire assay, in which a small portion of the material was burned away and the remaining residue weighed against the original to determine fineness, and only then was it cast into bars or coins, stamped with its certification marks, and entered into the ledger by the crown official responsible for that house's records. The weight notation pressed into each bar was not approximate. It was the figure recorded by the official scales, confirmed against the standard Marcos weight maintained at the assay house, and entered twice into the ledger in case one entry was later disputed. Every bar that left the assay house carried the history of its measurement on its surface, visible and permanent, the administrative life of the object inscribed into the object itself. Gold bars recovered from documented wrecks centuries later still bear these marks. The ones recovered from the Nuestra Señora de Atocha carry stamped assay notations, weight and marcos, fineness rating, the assay house of origin that can still be read, still matched against surviving documentary records from colonial archives in Seville and Lima. The bar that a diver's hand closes around in 55 feet of water in the Florida Straits is the same bar whose weight was recorded in a ledger in the Americas, whose fineness was certified by fire in a colonial assay house, whose certification marks were pressed into still cooling metal by a stamp held in a craftsman's hand. The centuries between the ledger entry and the recovery do not dissolve that connection. The object confirms the document, and the document confirms the object, and both of them confirm a system that treated bullion not as raw wealth, but as a formally attested material, moving through a chain of accountability that the Spanish crown maintained across an ocean. Once certified at the assay house, the bars were carried to the port of loading, Cartagena, Portobello, Vera Cruz, and placed under the supervision of crown officials, whose responsibility it was to match the physical cargo against the cargo manifest. This document, called the registro, was not a single page. For a fully loaded treasure galleon, it ran for hundreds of pages, each chest numbered, each item within each chest described and valued, each weight noted in the standardized units the crown required. The handwriting is dense in the surviving registers, held in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville. The ink has faded to brown over 4 centuries, but remains legible under careful light. A researcher turning those pages encounters not a list, but a world, the accumulated detail of a vast commercial and administrative operation translated into columns of notation on paper, each line representing something that was lifted, weighed, certified, and placed in the dark of a ship's hold. The register was required to exist in at least 3 copies. One was held by the captain, one was held by the ship's royal factor, the crown official who traveled with the cargo and was responsible for its delivery. The third was sealed in a watertight container, leather-wrapped, bound with cord, treated to resist the penetration of seawater, and kept in the captain's quarters under instructions that were specific and absolute. If the ship were threatened with capture by a foreign vessel, the sealed container was to be thrown overboard immediately, ahead of any other action, so that the cargo record could not fall into enemy hands. The document was considered worth more than the comfort of knowing where it was. A registro that survived on an enemy ship told that enemy exactly what the Spanish crown had been moving, the quantity of bullion, the weight and fineness of the bars, the identity of the colonial assay houses involved, the names of the merchants whose private cargo had been declared and taxed alongside the crown's own holdings. A registro thrown into the sea and lost told no one anything at all. There was a logic to this that the Spanish crown applied with complete consistency across the fleet system. The cargo manifest was not merely an administrative document, it was a security object, and it was treated like one. The leather wrapping and the cord binding were not afterthoughts, they were specified by royal ordinance, and the officials responsible for preparing the container were accountable for the quality of its sealing. A registro that was damaged or lost through inadequate preparation was the responsibility of the officer who had failed to seal it properly. The system that began with the stamped assay mark on a gold bar continued through the ledger entry, through the cargo manifest, through the sealed duplicate container, maintaining a chain of accountability that was designed to survive conditions the ship itself might not. The record was meant to outlast the voyage, A colonial monstrance being prepared for transport in Cartagena would have been laid open in its velvet-lined wooden case on a warehouse table near the harbor, where the light came in through the wide doorway and fell across the gold of the display crown and the stones set into it. The monstrances that appeared regularly on treasure ship manifests were not modest objects. Some colonial examples were constructed by master goldsmiths working in Lima or Bogota to commissions from wealthy churches and religious orders who intended to donate them to cathedrals in Spain or to present them at court. The circular display crown at the center of a monstrance, the radiant arrangement of gold rays surrounding the glass compartment where the consecrated host was held during Mass, could be set with emeralds sourced from the Colombian mines at Muzo and Chivor, rubies, amethysts, pearls brought up from the oyster beds of the Caribbean coast. Some colonial examples featured hundreds of individually set stones in graduated sizes, the largest at the center, the smallest filling the spaces between the outermost rays, each stone mounted in a setting that required a craftsman's hand and a jeweler's glass and hours of patient work. The tasador assigned to value such an object worked slowly. The standardized unit of weight the crown required was the marco, equivalent to approximately 230 grams, and the gold of the monstrance was weighed in marco, just as the bars in the hold were weighed in marcos. The stones were assessed separately, each one recorded by type and approximate weight and quality, the emeralds noted for their depth of color and the absence of inclusions, the rubies for their clarity. The total valuation was a composite figure, the metal weight at the certified gold price, the stones at the assessor's judgment of their quality, and that figure was entered into the registro alongside the item's description and the name of the religious institution that owned it and was entrusting it to the fleet for transport. The monstrance had a name, the institution had a name, the tasador had a name. All three appeared on the page. The weight of this careful attention was theological as well as material. The Spanish crown's relationship to the sacred objects moving aboard its treasure ships was not simply proprietary. A monstrance was not cargo in the same sense that a bar of silver was cargo. It was an object through which the consecrated host was displayed to a congregation during the Mass, which made it, in the theology of the period, an object that had participated in the mystery of the Eucharist and carried a significance that no bullion valuation could adequately capture. The crown's assessors gave it a number in marcos and entered that number in the register, but the ecclesiastical significance of the object ran beneath the administrative record in a different register entirely, one that expressed itself not in the ledger, but in what happened when such an object was lost. The destruction of consecrated religious objects in a sinking was treated by the Spanish crown as a theological catastrophe, not merely an economic one. The formal mourning observances that were convened at court following the documented losses of major treasure fleets were not simply acknowledgments of the financial damage. The masses said, the court in mourning dress, the formal declarations of loss entered into the royal record. They were responses to the fact that sacred things had gone into the sea. Replacement pieces were commissioned at royal expense in documented cases, not because a monstrance that had sat at the bottom of the ocean since 1622 could be replaced in any meaningful theological sense, but because the crown's responsibility to the churches and religious orders whose property had been entrusted to the fleet extended beyond the voyage's end. The obligation was recorded, the replacement was commissioned. The ledger of sacred objects lost and replaced was maintained with the same care as the ledger of bullion. Among the objects that traveled in the Camera del Tesoro, The locked compartment near the captain's quarters, where the most significant cargo was secured, were reliquaries. These were sealed ecclesiastical cases wrapped in cloth, their contents identified by the church or order that owned them, and recorded separately from the commercial cargo in a ledger maintained not by the crown's tesaders, but by the ship's chaplain. A reliquary was not weighed in marcos in the same column as a gold bar. It occupied its own category in the record, a category that acknowledged the nature of what it contained. The chaplain's ledger ran alongside the crown's registro as a parallel document, the sacred inventory and the commercial inventory proceeding through the same hold, on the same ship, but maintained in different hands and at different levels of administrative abstraction. The reliquary rested in the Camera del Tesoro, wrapped in its cloth, its case sealed with the ecclesiastical seal of the church that had entrusted it to the voyage, its identity known to the chaplain and to the captain and to no one else aboard the ship. The full register of what a single treasure galleon carried can be traced in the surviving pages of the registros held in Seville. A complete inventory runs across hundreds of pages and encompasses objects of extraordinary range and variety. Gold and silver bars are the largest category by weight, each one stamped and certified and entered by number. Coins follow, reales of 8, pieces minted at the colonial mints under crown contract, their weight and purity controlled to the same standards as the bars. Manufactured goods, gold chains, silver plate, worked jewelry occupy a middle category, objects that had been made. Rather than simply cast and certified, their value assessed by the tesadoras at the combination of their metal weight and their craftsmanship. Then the ecclesiastical objects entered separately or in the chaplain's parallel record, the monstrances, the chalices, the reliquaries, the small silver censers and cruets that belonged to the ship's own chapel, as well as those being transported as cargo. And among all of these, in the chests identified in the registro by their iron banding and their padlock count and their numerical designation, the private declarations of merchants who had paid the Averia tax to bring their own silver and gold aboard the fleet under the crown's protection. The merchants' declarations were themselves a formal record. The Averia was not an informal arrangement. It was a documented tax, assessed as a percentage of declared cargo value, paid at the point of loading, and recorded in the same administrative system that governed the Crown's own holdings. A merchant who paid the Averia received a receipt, and the receipt referenced a declaration, and the declaration itemized what the merchant was placing aboard the ship under protection of the Crown. The merchant's cargo was not kept separate from the Crown's cargo in any physical sense. Chests belonging to private merchants and chests belonging to the Crown rode in the same hold, secured to the same frames, but administratively they were entirely distinct. Each category of cargo tracked through its own chain of documentation, from the assay house to the port, to the registro, to the delivery receipt that would be signed in Seville when the chest was unlocked and its contents verified against the manifest. There is something in that system of layered documentation that reveals what the Spanish crown understood about the nature of what it was moving. A gold bar stamped with its assay marks and recorded in 3 copies of a cargo manifest that existed in a watertight container ready to be thrown overboard was not simply a quantity of precious metal. It was a documented quantity of precious metal, and the distinction mattered. The documentation transformed the raw material into a formal entity, a legal object with a recorded history, an administrative identity, and a chain of accountability that extended from the moment the ore came out of the ground in Peru or Mexico to the moment the bar was delivered to the treasury in Seville. The ship was the middle passage in that chain, and the Sistema de Flotas, the convoy system that moved the treasure across the Atlantic, was the mechanism through which the Spanish crown maintained that chain against the risks of the ocean and the competing interests of other powers. The sealed duplicate register sitting on its shelf in the captain's quarters was the chain made portable. It was the acknowledgement that the physical chain, the bars and chests and monstrances in the hold below, might be broken by forces the crown could not control, and that what survived the breaking must be at minimum the record of what had been lost. A ship that went to the bottom of the Florida Straits took its cargo with it, but if the sealed containers survived, the crown knew with precision what had been aboard, every bar by weight and fineness, every monstrance by metal and stone, every merchant's declaration by chest number and contents and assessed value. The registro was not a comfort, but it was something, a formal acknowledgement of the gap where the cargo had been, precise enough that the crown could state with authority what it had lost, even if it could never recover it. The gold chalice set with emeralds and fitted with a bezoar stone, a stone believed by the physicians and pharmacologists of the period to detect or neutralize poison when immersed in a liquid, and which therefore made such a chalice both a liturgical and a protective object, traveled to the hold in the same way any other declared object traveled. It was assessed by a tassador who recorded its metal weight and described its emeralds by number and approximate quality. It was entered into the registro under the name of the institution or individual who had declared ownership of it. It was placed in a chest that was assigned a number, and the chest was assigned a location in the hold, and the location was recorded. The administrative machinery moved around it without touching its meaning. The bezoar stone and the emeralds and the liturgical gold were formal objects now, numbered and documented and carried into the dark of the hold, where the chains secured the chests to the inner frames, and the iron bands of the lids were closed and locked by the officers who held the keys. The locks themselves were part of the system. The Camera del Tesoro, the low-ceilinged locked compartment in the stern of the ship, where the most significant crown cargo was secured, required multiple keys held by separate officers, so that no single individual could open it alone. This was not an informal precaution. It was specified in the regulations governing the loading and transport of royal cargo, and the officers responsible for holding the keys were named in the ship's official documents alongside their specific roles and obligations. A chest that required 3 keys to open had 3 key holders, each one accountable to the crown for their portion of the security. The iron bands on the lids were inspected before departure. The locks were tested. The inspection was recorded. Consider the formal weight of all this care. The hull had been inspected by a vide, or who pressed his hands against the caulked seams and signed his inspection record before loading could begin. The cargo had been certified by assay houses in the Americas, weighed and stamped and entered into ledgers by Crown officials accountable for the accuracy of every figure they recorded. The register had been prepared in 3 copies, one sealed in a waterproof container by a process specified in royal ordinance and ready to be thrown overboard if the situation required it. The Camera del Tesoro had been locked with multiple keys distributed among separate officers, so that no single point of failure could expose the crown's most significant holdings. Every layer of this system existed because the Spanish crown understood that what it was moving was not simply valuable, but formally documented, and that the documentation was as important as the value. The colonial monstrance, in its velvet-lined case, closed now and latched, carried into the lower hold by 2 men who handled it without setting it down on the floor. The reliquary in the chaplain's care, wrapped in its cloth and placed in the Camera del Tesoro among the gold bars, its sealed ecclesiastical case resting against the iron-banded chest it was wedged beside. The pages of the register in their 3 copies, one in the captain's quarters, one with the royal factor, one in its leather-wrapped waterproof container on the shelf, where it would remain unless the worst happened and someone reached for it with urgency. The Tazadore's ledger, complete and closed. The chaplain's parallel record, complete and closed. The assay house registers in Lima and Mexico City and Potosi, each one retaining its own entry for every bar that had passed through its certification process and was now 3,000 miles away in the hold of a ship, riding low in the water of Havana Harbor. The weight of the cargo in the hold was not a number one person knew in its entirety. The Tazadores knew the total valuation of what they had assessed. The royal factor knew the total of the Crown's declared holdings. The captain knew approximately what the ship had taken on by how she sat in the water, how she responded when the anchor chain came up and the sails began to fill. But the sum of all of it, every bar by weight, every monstrance by stone count, every merchant's chest by declared value, existed in its completeness only in the register. The document held the whole. The ship held the physical reality of the whole. They were the same inventory in 2 different forms, one written on paper and one distributed through 3 decks of a vessel built from Cuban cedar and Havana mahogany, sealed with pine tar, riding the slow swell of a Caribbean afternoon. The Camera del Tesoro in the stern, just forward of the captain's quarters. The oil lamp hung from the ceiling beam, giving just enough light to see the shapes of the chests, secured to the floor, the iron bands catching the light, the locks closed. A space barely large enough for 2 men to stand in without touching the walls. The chests bolted to the floor through their base plates, the chains securing the largest ones, looped through rings, set into the inner hull frames, and fastened with padlocks whose keys were held by officers whose names were in the ship's official papers. The monstrance in its case, which would not open again until Seville. The reliquary in its wrapping, which would not be unwrapped until the ecclesiastical officials in Spain were present to receive it. The sealed register in its container, which would not be opened unless the ship was taken or sinking, 2 conditions that the men who had prepared it worked not to contemplate. The lamp gave its small orange light to the room, and the room held everything the system had placed there. The gold was gold. The emeralds set into the monstrance's crown were emeralds. The weight was real, and the marks stamped into the bars were real, and the figures in the ledgers were real. Outside the hull, the sea was running with the late afternoon light across it, the harbor still, the sails not yet set. The Camera del Tesoro sat in its quiet, in the stern of the ship, its door locked by 3 keys, its contents recorded in the register and in the chaplain's parallel ledger, and in the assay house records, and in the ledgers of the Tazadores, who had weighed and valued everything that had been placed inside. The register was on its shelf. The duplicate was sealed in its waterproof container, bound with cord, waiting for an emergency that might never come, prepared against a contingency that the system was designed to prevent, but honest enough to acknowledge was possible. It sat in its container on its shelf in the captain's quarters, its pages carefully prepared in the hand of a colonial clerk who had spent perhaps several weeks producing the complete 3-copy document, held the entire inventory of the hold in columns of dense brown notation, every chest numbered, every item described, every weight recorded in marcos, every fineness rating transcribed from the assay house, stamping on the bars themselves. The record of everything in the hold was itself treated as something worth saving. The paperwork of gold was considered almost as precious as the gold itself. The sealed container waited on its shelf in the captain's quarters, the cord around it tight, the leather wrapping smooth and dry, the pages inside dense with the careful notation of a world that had weighed everything it was placing in the dark and written it all down, and found it sufficient to have done so, and closed the container and set it on the shelf where it would remain until it was needed, or until the voyage was completed, and it was not needed after all. The entire record of the cargo held in a darkness, just a short distance from the cargo itself. One document and one hold, both sealed, both waiting, the lamp in the Camera del Tesoro still burning its small and steady light. The anchor chain began to move before full light had returned to the sky above Havana Harbor. The sound of it would have carried, iron through iron, the long chain lifting its own weight out of the harbor floor in links, each one dripping back the shallow water of the bay as the capstan turned and the men at the bars walked their slow circles on the deck above. The morning of departure from Havana was not a silent thing. There were shouted orders across the water between ships, the creak of rigging being hauled taut, the sound of small boats moving between hulls in the last hour before the fleet committed itself to the open sea. The city sat behind all of it, low and white above the harbor wall, the buildings catching the early light that had not yet found the water. The fleet that assembled in Havana that late summer was low in the water under its cargo. A fully loaded treasure galleon sat noticeably deeper than a vessel in ballast, the additional draft visible along the hull where the waterline rose toward the gun ports, the ship pressing down into the harbor's calm with the weight of everything stowed in its holds. From a distance, riding at anchor among the other vessels of the combined fleet. Such a ship would have looked heavy and deliberate, a thing built to carry, not to move quickly, its hull proportions calculated for capacity before speed. The sails, not yet fully set, hung loosely in the early morning air as the anchors broke free of the harbor bottom one by one. The route from Havana was not chosen each voyage. It was established by experience accumulated over more than a century of crossings, formalized in navigational documents held under restriction, followed because the geography of the Caribbean gave the treasure fleets no other practical option for returning to Spain. The two great fleets, the Flota de Nueva España, which served the ports of New Spain, and the Galeones de Tierra Firme, which called at the ports along the Spanish Main, converged at Havana, specifically because the Florida Straits offered what no other passage could provide, the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a current of exceptional force. It runs northward through the Florida Straits at speeds that a heavily loaded galleon could add directly to its own progress, providing what navigators of the period understood to be a reliable eastward acceleration once the fleet cleared the straits and turned toward the open Atlantic. In the era before engines, such a current was not a convenience, but a structural feature of the route, the difference between a crossing that was merely difficult and one that was possible at all with ships of that weight and that rigging plan. Every pilot who navigated those waters knew the current and planned for it. The problem the current also created was known equally well, and it was this: the same channel that offered the stream's acceleration pressed the fleet through a corridor of shallow water close against the reef system of the Florida Keys, where the margin between deep passage and catastrophe was measured in feet rather than miles. The Florida Keys reef tract runs for approximately 170 miles along the outer edge of the Keys archipelago, from the shallow waters south of Biscayne Bay, all the way southwest to the dry Tortugas. It is not a single reef, but a nearly continuous system of coral formation, mostly in water between 10 and 30 feet deep, shallow enough that a galleon drawing 20 feet of water would strike bottom well before any watch on deck could distinguish the reef from the dark surface of the surrounding sea at night. Spanish navigational charts of the period rendered this reef system as a jagged serrated edge drawn along the eastern margin of the route north, annotated with warnings, and in some versions with the names of ships that had previously grounded there. The pilots who ran the straits knew the charts. They also knew that charts could not account for variation in a vessel's actual draft under full cargo load, or for the difference between a star fix taken at dusk and the ship's actual position 6 hours later in the dark. The Havana harbor pilot who saw a fleet out through the Narrows would have watched the last ships clear the harbor mouth before returning to the city. The fleet belonged to the sea once it passed that point, and the men responsible for its passage were the pilots aboard each vessel, the pilots who held the charts, who took the celestial observations, who managed the instruments of navigation that stood between the ship's position and uncertainty. On the deck of a 17th century galleon, the primary instruments of navigation were few enough to be held in one man's hands. The mariner's compass provided direction, a magnetized needle floating in a compass bowl, housed in a wooden binnacle near the helm, giving the helmsman a reference for maintaining course. The cross staff or astrolabe provided latitude, an instrument for measuring the angle of a known star or the sun above the horizon, from which a competent pilot could calculate how far north or south of the equator the ship was sailing. These instruments required a steady platform and clear skies, and some experience in their use, and when conditions denied any one of those requirements, the measurement was approximate rather than precise. The cross staff required the user to stand at the stern rail or at some other elevated position on deck, and to hold the instrument level against a star or the sun, sliding a crosspiece along the graduated staff until the shadow fell at the correct point, then reading the angle from the scale marked along the wood. In calm conditions at dusk, with a steady horizon and a known star rising at a predictable point in the sky, the reading gave a latitude accurate enough for practical use. In anything less than those ideal conditions, a pitching deck, a hazy horizon, an overcast sky, the reading came out less certain, and the pilot recorded it knowing the limits of what the instrument had told him. The third instrument aboard, the ampuletta, measured time rather than position. It was a sand glass, typically running for half an hour, mounted in a wooden frame and turned by the watchkeeper as the last grains fell into the lower chamber. Each turning of the glass was noted in the Diario de Navegación, the ship's daily log, along with the speed estimated by the log line, a piece of wood thrown over the stern and timed as the vessel moved away from it, the length of line paid out across the measured interval, giving a rough figure for speed in knots. From speed and time, a pilot could calculate the distance the ship had traveled since the last celestial fix. From the last known position and that distance estimate, he could calculate the current position. Dead reckoning, the practice was called, the reasoning of one's position from the dead certainty of the last known point forward through time and motion. Every dead reckoning calculation accumulates error. Each estimate of speed is close, not exact. Each half hour of sand in the ampuletta runs close to 30 minutes, not precisely. Each turning of the glass adds a small imprecision to the one that came before it, and over days and hundreds of miles, those imprecisions compound into a difference between the position marked on the chart and the position the ship actually occupied. Experienced pilots knew this and applied corrections drawn from their knowledge of the currents along the route, the Gulf Stream's northward push, the set of local currents near the coast, but corrections applied to an approximate position produced an adjusted approximate position. The calculation was always working toward the truth. It did not always arrive there before the ship did. Longitude was not part of the calculation in any reliable sense. The mathematics for determining a ship's east-west position at sea required knowing the precise difference between local time and a reference time at a known meridian, which in turn required a timepiece accurate enough to maintain that reference across weeks at sea without accumulating its own error. No such timepiece existed in the 17th century. The marine chronometer would not be developed to the necessary standard of accuracy until the 18th century, more than 100 years after the treasure fleet era. The pilots of the galleon age knew their latitude with reasonable confidence when the sky was clear and their instruments were properly calibrated. They did not know their longitude. They knew only approximately how far east or west they had traveled from the last point where they had been certain of it, and even that was the product of the dead reckoning calculation, with all its accumulated imprecision. A fleet departing Havana in late summer moved out of the harbor into the Florida Straits, with the city falling behind it at the pace of loaded ships in moderate wind. The pilots on each vessel would have taken a celestial observation before the sky faded. The latitude of Havana itself was well documented, and then made their mark on the chart and turned their attention to the work of the passage north through the straits. The lead line would have been deployed from the bow. A weighted cord dropped rhythmically to the seafloor to return a measurement of depth. The soundings called forward along the deck by the man who held the line. In shallow water navigation, depth was another instrument, a confirmation that the ship was in the channel, not too close to the reef, to the east or the shallows that bordered the Cuban coast to the west. The sounding calls carried their own rhythm, repeated as the ship moved, the leadsman pulling the cord back up and swinging the weight forward again, and dropping it, the cord streaming back under the ship's motion until it hung straight down in the water and he could feel the tension that told him the weight had touched bottom. Each depth noted was another point of reference, another entry in the log, the pilot correlating the soundings against the depths marked on the chart to track the fleet's progress up the channel. It was careful work, methodical, built on accumulated repetition. The channel was narrow enough, and the consequences of misjudgment significant enough, that care was the only option. Royal ordinances governing the departure of treasure fleets from Havana were specific about the calendar. The fleets were required to depart by mid-August at the latest, a cutoff designed to ensure the fleet cleared the Caribbean and entered the open Atlantic before the heart of the hurricane season made the passage genuinely dangerous. The reasoning behind the rule was not theoretical. The Spanish crown understood perfectly well that late-season storms could rise quickly in those waters, and that a fleet loaded with the annual product of the colonial silver mines was too valuable to risk against a hurricane that the calendar could have helped avoid. The rule was formal, documented, and regularly exceeded by the demands of the voyages themselves. Loading delays accumulated at the colonial ports. Convoys from the interior arrived late. Disputes over manifests held ships in harbor while the paperwork was corrected. Officials who had to sign the cargo documentation were sometimes unavailable, sometimes ill, sometimes resolving other matters that also required their attention. The economic pressure to get the full cargo aboard before departing meant that a fleet waiting for the last chests from the interior was a fleet waiting in Havana past the August cutoff and waiting past it into September, when the probability of encountering a late-season storm in the Florida Straits climbed each week. The record of the great fleet losses of the 17th and 18th centuries follows this pattern with a consistency that documents rather than surprises. The 1622 disaster that destroyed 8 ships of the combined treasure fleet including the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, occurred in September. The 1715 fleet disaster occurred in July, at the later edge of the season. The 1733 fleet disaster occurred in July as well. Each fell within the prohibited or marginal window, and each was partly the product of the accumulated pressure that kept fleets in harbor past the safe departure point. A fleet that departed Havana in September was not unaware of the risk it was accepting. The pilots knew the calendar as well as they knew the charts. The fleet commanders knew the ordinances they were violating by running late. The captains of individual ships understood the season and the weather patterns associated with it. The awareness was present throughout the fleet, documented in correspondence between fleet commanders and colonial officials that still exists in the Spanish archives. The records showing the discussions and the decisions and the reasoning that was applied, the judgment that this year, with the cargo assembled and the merchants pressing for departure, and the colonial administration already behind its schedule, the passage could be made before the worst of the season descended. That judgment was not always wrong. In most years, fleets that departed late in the season cleared the straits before any significant storm found them. The record of those uneventful passages is preserved in the same archives as the record of the disasters, the routine crossings taking up far more shelf space than the catastrophes, the ordinary voyages that arrived safely, leaving behind their manifests and their pilot logs and their correspondence, and then passing out of the narrative because nothing unusual had occurred. The departure from Havana for the voyage that would end in the 1622 disaster was made against this background: the late season sky, the loaded ships, the calendar already past the window, the ordinances specified. The city would have appeared, to someone watching from the stern of a departing galleon, as a low line of buildings along the harbor mouth, the stone fortifications that guarded the entrance clear in the morning air, the water of the harbor channel dark and calm. The city fell back as the ships moved through the narrows into the straits, the rooftops diminishing against the morning sky, the harbor opening behind the fleet as the open water opened ahead of it. The sky above the Florida Straits in late summer can present itself in several registers. There are days of flat, blue, high-pressure calm, the water settled to a long, gentle swell, the horizon clear and sharp in every direction, the air steady enough for reliable celestial observation, and the ships making steady progress under full sail. There are days of building cumulus, the tall white columns of cloud rising over the Florida coast to the north, the air becoming heavier as the afternoon progresses, the swell increasing by the end of the day, and the horizon blurring at its edges with the moisture that builds before a storm. The transition between these registers is not always marked with visible warning in the hours before it matters. A sky that looked acceptable at dusk could by pre-dawn have organized itself into something entirely different. The barometric pressure that skilled pilots monitored through the behavior of the clouds and the swell and the behavior of the sea surface, giving them whatever warning the instruments of the age could provide. Survivor testimony from the 1622 disaster, recorded by Spanish colonial officials in Havana in the days immediately following, describes the storm as striking the fleet before dawn, with winds so strong that the sailors could not stand on deck. The phrase in the testimony is plain and specific, not metaphorical, not reaching for literary effect, but the straightforward account of men who had been on deck when it happened and were now describing it to officials with ledgers open in front of them. The testimony was collected as part of the official investigation into the loss, the colonial administration attempting to establish what had happened and what had been aboard the ships that went down the record-keeping instinct of the Spanish bureaucratic apparatus running even in the immediate aftermath of disaster. The men who spoke to those officials had survived. The Atoa, carrying an estimated 500 people, had not, or not most of them. The survivors they counted were fewer than a dozen. The storm itself would not have announced itself in a way that allowed orderly preparation. Pre-dawn is the darkest point of the night watch. The horizon invisible, the sea surface readable only by sound and feel rather than sight. The deck watch relying on what the wind and the movement of the ship communicated to them through the soles of their feet and the pressure of the air against their faces. A shift in wind direction would have been felt before it was understood. The sea surface would have changed before the helmsman could translate the change into an adjustment, of course. The rigging would have begun to sound differently in the increasing wind before anyone on deck had a complete picture of what was coming. The pilot's Diario de Navegación, if it survived for a voyage that ended in disaster, would have contained entries up to the last observation made before the storm struck. The final entries in such a log would look like any other entries. The time of the observation, the latitude calculated from the cross-staff reading, the depth from the last sounding, a note on the wind direction, and the estimated speed. The handwriting would be the pilot's ordinary handwriting, the careful professional notation of a man doing his routine work, recording what the instruments had told him in the expectation that the record would be continued at the next observation period. The last entry would not know it was the last entry. There would be nothing in the ink or the phrasing to indicate that the next half hour of sand in the Ampeletta would not be turned, that the next depth sounding would not be called, that the diario would not be opened again. What those final entries would have shown, if they survived, is simply the ship's situation as the pilot understood it at the last moment he had enough calm to observe and record it. A position estimated by dead reckoning from the last celestial fix. A depth consistent with the chart's depiction of the Straits Channel. A wind from a specific direction, the sails set accordingly, the fleet moving north through the corridor between the reef and the Cuban coast at the pace a heavily loaded galleon made good in a moderate breeze. Everything in order, as far as the instruments and the charts could show. The reef to the east close enough to warrant the lead line, but not so close as to appear threatening to a pilot confident in his position. The Gulf Stream running under the keel, pushing the fleet north and east at the rate the current always ran, adding its knots to the ship's own progress, carrying everything forward through the dark water of the straits toward the open Atlantic that lay beyond. The Florida Reef would not have been visible in the pre-dawn dark. It would have offered no more warning than a change in the soundings, the depth coming up suddenly as the water shoaled over the coral formation. The lead line returning from a cast that showed 5 feet less than the one before it, then 5 feet less again. The numbers coming fast and wrong, in the way that numbers come when a ship is moving too quickly towards something that was not where the chart said it should be. Or perhaps the position error had been larger than the pilot understood, and the reef was closer than the last sounding had suggested, and the first indication was not a gradual shoaling, but the sound of the hull making contact with coral in 30 feet of water. But this is the sequence that is known from the physical evidence and the survivor accounts: the storm, the loss of steerage, the lateral force of the waves working against the hull, the water entering the hold. The specific chronology of those final minutes is not documented with the precision of the log entries that preceded the storm. What the record shows is the outcome and the survivor accounts and the position where the ship was found centuries later. The interval between the last log entry and the seafloor is where the documentation goes quiet. The instruments packed away or swept overboard, the diario closed and wet, and finally lost. There is a particular quality to the final entries of a navigational log that predates the end of the voyage. The pilot at his table in the stern cabin, the oil lamp throwing its yellow light across the page, the inkwell secured against the motion of the ship, the handwriting flowing in the practiced lines of someone who has made these entries hundreds of times before. The form of it is professional and routine. The depth figures, the latitude calculation, the wind direction, the time of the observation, all of it recorded in the manner the pilot has always recorded it, because the manner was not contingent on what came after. He was recording what the ship knew about itself at that moment. The ship knew its depth, its latitude, its speed, the direction of the wind in its sails. It knew these things as well as the instruments of the age could determine them. What the instruments could not determine, what no pilot of that era could measure or record, was the gap between the position the dead reckoning showed and the position the ship actually occupied, the accumulated error of the crossing, the unmeasurable longitude, the set of the current between the last fix and this one. That gap was always there. In most voyages, it resolved without consequence. The ship arrived, the manifest was tallied, the cargo was unloaded, the pilot closed the diario, with the last entry being the notation of arrival in a Spanish port. The late summer sky above the straits held all of this in suspension for the days the fleet was in passage. The soundings came back in sequence from the lead line. The ampeletta turned at its half-hour intervals, and the watchkeeper wrote the time in the log. The compass held the fleet on its heading, north-northeast through the corridor, the current running beneath the hull, the reef to the east rendered as a line of ink on the chart, spread across the pilot's table in the stern cabin. The fleet moved together through the water, the hulls low under their cargo, the late-season sky somewhere between calm and something the clouds were beginning to suggest at the horizon. The last depth sounding before the storm was a number, a specific figure in feet, written in the pilot's hand in the margin of the log, the lead line having returned from the harbor bottom with that much water below the keel. The number was consistent with the channel. It was consistent with the position the pilot understood the fleet to occupy. It was, in the way that everything recorded in the diario was accurate, an honest record of what the instrument had found. The instrument had found the bottom at that depth. The pilot had written it down. The sand in the ampeletta ran out and was turned, and the watch continued. The note on the wind direction was the last observation the record preserves. The wind was from a specific quarter. The entry would have said which, in the abbreviated notation that navigators used. The compass direction compressed to its conventional shorthand in the log's margin. Whatever that direction was, the sails were set to make best use of it, the fleet moving at the speed the combination of current and canvas produced, the hours of the night watch passing in the way that hours pass, on a ship in passage, in the small repetitions of the sand glass, the sounding, the compass check, the note in the log, the sounding again. That is where the record pauses. The pilot's entry sits on the page. The ink dried. The lamp in the stern cabin continued to burn as long as it had oil. The sand in the ampeletta ran toward the bottom of its lower chamber in the dark of the watch, the last grains settling into the pile that had accumulated there through all the half hours of the crossing, each grain one moment of time that the diario had recorded and the voyage had used. The fleet was in the straits. The depth was consistent with the chart. The wind was from the direction the pilot had written down. The Camera del Tesoro was sealed below, its iron-banded chests secured to the floor in the dark of the lower hull. The registor sat in its watertight container on the shelf in the captain's quarters. the full inventory of everything in the hold, recorded in the careful hand of the colonial clerk who had compiled it in Havana while the anchors still held the ship to the harbor floor. All of it was in motion through the dark water of the Florida Straits, the city long gone behind the stern, the open Atlantic ahead. The pilot's log entry was dry. The crossing continued as crossings continue, in the dark, in the quiet, in the slow accumulation of distance between the last known point and the one that came after it, the instruments doing what instruments do, the calculation running forward from certainty into the approximate, the fleet carrying its cargo and its records and its accumulated error northward through the corridor of water between the reef and the coast, the lead line ready, the sand running, the entry already made, and nothing left to add until the next observation, which the half-hour glass would announce when it ran through. The survivor accounts were recorded in Havana in the days immediately following the storm. Spanish colonial officials sat across from men who had been pulled from the water or clung to wreckage through a September night, and they wrote down what those men said in careful administrative language, the way officials write things, not to preserve feeling, but to establish fact. The documents that survived are held now in archives in Spain. They are dry reading, deliberately so. A storm struck before dawn. The winds were strong enough that sailors could not stand on deck. The fleet was in the Florida Straits, making north toward open Atlantic when the weather arrived. That is the official account's beginning. The rest is inference, physical law, and what the seafloor eventually gave up. The hurricane of September 16, 22, found the combined treasure fleet before it had cleared the Narrows. The two great convoys, the Flota de Nueva España and the Galeones de Tierra Firme, had assembled in Havana harbor and departed together, their hulls sitting low and heavy in the water under the full weight of their loaded cargo, the late summer sky holding that particular flat quality that can precede change in the Caribbean. The fleet carried the accumulated wealth of a season's colonial collection, gold bars stamped and weighed at the assay houses of Potosi and Mexico City and Lima, silver in quantities that required their own separate accounting, religious objects in sealed ecclesiastical cases, commercial goods in the ordinary lower holds, and the personal effects of passengers crossing back toward a Spain most of them had not seen in years. 28 ships made the passage out of Havana harbor. 8 of them would not complete the crossing. The Nuestra Señora de Atocha was among those 8. So was the Santa Margarita and 6 others whose names appear in the colonial records alongside them. The estimate of lives lost runs to approximately 550 people, a figure drawn from manifests, from later inquiries, from the head counts of those who were eventually pulled from the water or found clinging to wreckage on the morning after the storm. It is one of the largest single losses recorded in the entire history of the Spanish flota system, the network of convoys that carried the New World's extracted wealth to Seville across the span of more than 2 centuries. The mechanics of how a galleon fails in a hurricane begin before any water enters the hull. The masts go first, or nearly first. The upper rigging of a fully laden galleon was an extraordinary apparatus of wood and rope and canvas, capable under favorable conditions of catching enough wind to move 1,000 tons of ship and cargo at useful speed across an ocean. Under the lateral force of a hurricane, that same apparatus became a liability, the tall masts acting as levers against the hull, the rigging transmitting the force of the storm directly into the ship's structural frame. A ship that loses its main mast in extreme weather loses more than propulsion. It loses the ability to orient itself against the waves. The bowsprit and the mizzen mast might remain, might provide some minimal steerage, but a dismasted galleon in a hurricane was essentially a floating box subject to the full unmanaged force of wave action against its broadside, rolling in a manner the hull was not designed to sustain indefinitely. The wave action worked on the caulking. Every seam in a galleon's hull was packed with oakum, fibers of hemp rope driven into the gaps between planks with an iron caulking tool, and then sealed with pine tar or pitch, and those seams held the ship watertight, not through rigidity, but through compression, the planks pressing together under the tension of the hull's assembled frame. A hull rolling violently in a beam C-flexed, the planks worked against each other. The caulking that had been pressed tight against pine tar in a Caribbean shipyard, inspected by a Vidor with a lantern and tested with his thumb against each seam, began to loosen under forces it was never meant to absorb for hours at a time. When the caulking loosened, water found its way in, slowly at first and then faster, because each roll that worked the planks further widened the gaps. The bilge pumps were the standard response. Spanish naval regulations of the 17th century were clear on the point. Every able-bodied person aboard a ship in distress was to be assigned to pumping duty, passengers included, the division of labor rotating to sustain continuous operation of the hand-operated bilge pumps that every galleon carried as standard equipment. A working bilge pump could move a meaningful quantity of water out of a lower hold, but it required continuous human effort, and it operated against whatever rate water was entering the hull, through loosened seams, through open gun ports, overwhelmed by breaking waves, through damage to the hull's lower structure from the kind of grounding that the Florida Reef Tract was capable of causing within minutes of contact. The Florida Keys Reef is not a reef of the gentle, gradual kind. The reef tract stretches roughly 170 miles along the edge of what would have been the fleet's passage north from Biscayne Bay southwest toward the dry Tortugas, and it consists of formations of sharp living coral sitting in water depths of between 10 and 30 feet, close enough to the surface that a galleon drawing 20 feet of water in its loaded state could strike bottom without warning in seas that obscured any visual indication of the depth below. The coral was capable of opening a galleon's hull, planking with something that was less like a collision and more like a slow tearing, the hull riding up onto a coral head under the push of a wave, hanging there for a moment under its own weight, then sliding and grinding as the next wave carried it forward. A hull breached in that manner did not close itself again. The regulations also specified the jettisoning of heavy deck cargo and cannon as an emergency measure to raise the ship's waterline, to lighten the vessel enough that it floated higher and reduce the depth at which the lower hull was exposed to reef damage or to the intake of water through the loosened seam lines. Bronze cannon weighed between 1 and 2 tons each, and a fully armed galleon of the Atosha's class carried between 20 and 24 guns. To jettison a cannon required more than simply pushing it over the rail. The guns were secured in their carriages, which were themselves secured to the gun deck with rope and iron fittings designed to hold them against the ordinary motion of the ship at sea. In a storm that prevented sailors from standing upright on deck, the work of cutting or releasing those fittings, rolling the carriages to the rail, and managing the gun over the side without allowing its weight to shift catastrophically was not straightforward. There is no surviving account specific enough to confirm how many guns, if any, the Atosha's crew managed to jettison before the end. What the seafloor confirms is that a line of iron cannon remained with the hull when it settled. The Atosha came to rest in approximately 55 feet of water in the Florida Straits. That is a specific depth, shallow enough that the ship's mizzenmast remained above the surface after the hull touched bottom. The survivor accounts describe 5 people clinging to that mast through the night following the storm, the only point of the ship remaining above the flat water of the straits once the sea had come. The mast rising from the water in the calm after the storm, in the gray light of early morning after the hurricane had moved on, would have been visible from a distance, a single vertical line above a smooth sea, nothing else of the ship apparent from the surface. Those 5 survivors were the record. They were the ones the colonial officials in Havana interviewed. Below the surface, in the time immediately after the Etosha settled, the ship was still largely intact, or intact enough that Spanish dive operations launched within weeks of the sinking could locate and partially access it. The Spanish crown was fully aware of the value of what was at the bottom of the straits, and the administrative machinery that had originally loaded the cargo into the Etosha's bodega and Camara del Tesoro was still operating, still interested in recovery. The salvage effort that followed the 1622 hurricane was serious, technically sophisticated by the standards of the period, and partially successful on the Santa Margarita, which was in shallower water and somewhat more accessible, but it recovered relatively little from the Etosha itself. The salvage boats were small vessels called zabras, nimble enough to anchor over a wreck site in the exposed waters of the straits, and the divers were primarily indigenous free divers, whose breath-hold capabilities and knowledge of underwater conditions made them the most effective human recovery tools available to the Spanish salvage operators of the 17th century. A free diver descending through the clear water of the Florida Straits in the weeks after a hurricane, the wreck visible from the surface through 50 feet of water, would have seen the outline of the Etosha's hull below, the shapes of the gun deck, the dark openings of the cargo holds, the scattered debris of the ship's upper works drifting on the current around the main structural mass. The cargo hatches, if still intact, would have required cutting or breaking to reach the bodega below. The storm surge that sank the ship would have moved loose material, lighter objects, smaller items in the same direction the current ran, spreading a field of artifacts out from the main hull in the direction of the dominant flow. A second storm struck the wreck site before the Spanish salvage operation could fully exploit it. The Etosha was buried under shifted sand, its position less certain, the access to its holds closed by sediment. The Spanish crown continued to maintain official interest in the recovery. Royal records show that the effort was sustained and funded for a significant period, but the Etosha itself resisted. The Santa Margarita gave up more of its cargo to Spanish divers over the years that followed, recovered gold and silver that found its way back into the colonial accounting system. The Etosha held what it had. The process by which a galleon becomes an artifact scatter field across a seafloor over a period of centuries is gradual and follows physical laws that are now well understood. The heaviest objects, iron cannon, lead shot, chests containing gold bars, sink most directly downward through whatever sediment exists at the time of the sinking and remain closest to the hull's main structural remains. Their weight resists the forces that move lighter objects. An iron cannon does not travel with a current. A chest of gold bars, once its wooden casing has rotted away over decades, leaves its contents lying in a rough approximation of where the chest was when the hull finally settled permanently. The gold bars themselves, being chemically stable, do not corrode in salt water the way iron does. They lie in the sand in the dark, unchanged. Lighter objects move differently. Ceramic olive jars, wooden boxes, fabric, leather, navigational instruments, personal belongings, these drifted in the direction of the current, carried outward from the main hull structure, over years and decades, settling at varying distances depending on their buoyancy and the strength of the water movement over them. The wooden hull itself became the most dynamic element of the wreck's long dispersal. As the hull's structural members rotted and gave way, the objects they had enclosed or supported settled lower, shifted, and became part of a flattening and spreading archaeological record rather than a three-dimensional ship. What had been a galleon with vertical structure, gun decks stacked above cargo holds, the captain's stern cabin elevated above the waterline, the bowsprit angling upward toward the bow, gradually became horizontal, a field of material pressed down into the sand over the dimensions the hull had once occupied, with a scatter extending outward in the current's direction, the whole record readable if one understood what spread of objects meant. The iron cannon corroded slowly. Iron in salt water does not simply rust in the way iron in open air does. It undergoes a process of electrochemical change that over centuries converts much of the metal to iron oxide while maintaining enough structural form that the original object remains recognizable in shape. The cannonballs in the Etosha's shot locker, stored forward in the ship's hull, fused together over the centuries into concreted masses, the iron of each ball merging with the iron of its neighbors through the oxidation process. The individual spherical shapes, still readable within the larger mass, but no longer separable, a solid rusted object that recorded precisely where the shot locker had been and what it had contained. Those masses of fused cannonballs, lying in the sand in the position of the Etosha's forward hold, were among the most reliable structural markers of the wreck's location when it was eventually systematically searched. Heavy objects that had not moved, that had stayed where they fell, that held the ship's geometry in their arrangement long after the wood that once surrounded them had gone. The gold bars required no such inference. They were gold. They lay in the sand where the bodega had settled, dark against white sand in 55 feet of water, waiting with the particular patience of things that do not change. Silver coins fared differently. Silver in salt water darkens through a sulfide reaction, the surface of each coin converting to silver, sulfide over time, and producing the black tarnish that is the first visual signature of silver recovered from a long submerged wreck. The coins themselves remained intact as physical objects, the stamped designs of the Spanish colonial minting houses still readable beneath the sulfide layer, the denomination and fineness marks still present once the surface was cleaned, but they were visually unrecognizable as silver when found, dark discs lying in clusters in the sand, the kind of object that looks like nothing useful until it is brought to the surface and examined. A field extending perhaps 200 yards in the current's direction, spreading outward from the main hull mass, that was the Atocha's archaeological signature in the Florida Straits sand. Gold bars lying at angles, their stamped assay marks facing whatever direction the current had settled them. Silver coins blackened to near invisibility, broken ceramic jars from the ship's stores, the iron masses of corroded artillery equipment, and over all of it, the particular stillness of 55 feet of open Atlantic water, the current moving above, the sand shifting in small increments with each tide, the wreck site existing in a perpetual slow process of dispersal, that the ocean would have continued until there was nothing identifiable left. That process was interrupted in the 20th century, but not for a long time. The Etosha lay in the Florida Straits for 3.5 centuries before anyone found the specific location of its main structural remains. 60 years of those centuries had passed since the founding of the United States, before the wreck site fell within any organized jurisdiction. Another century passed before the technology existed to search for it systematically. The wreck lay outside the historical memory of anyone who might have recognized it as significant or commercially valuable. For most of that span, its position known in the broadest regional terms from the Spanish salvage records, somewhere in the Florida Straits, somewhere in the vicinity of the Dry Tortugas, but not specifically located, not mapped, not accessible. The specific scatter pattern around the Atochas remains, the way the artifact spread outward from the main hull mass in the direction the prevailing current runs, is one of the primary tools that contemporary underwater archaeology uses to read a wreck site before significant excavation begins. A side-scan sonar survey of a debris field produces an acoustic image of the sea floor that shows the main structural mass and the distribution of dense objects around it. And from that distribution, an archaeologist can begin to reconstruct the original orientation of the hull, estimate the depth to which sediment has covered the main remains, and identify which areas of the field are likely to contain which categories of object. The heaviest things are near the keel line, the lighter things are where the current took them. The whole field, read carefully, is a record of the ship's final moments and of every tide and current that has moved through that stretch of water in the years since. The work of stabilizing what is recovered from a wreck site like the Atocha is slow and technically demanding in ways that are almost the inverse of dramatic. A gold bar lifted from the Florida Straits seafloor after 3.5 centuries in salt water is chemically stable and requires relatively little conservation treatment. The gold has not reacted with its environment in any fundamental way. Its stamped assay marks are intact, its weight is unchanged. An iron cannon recovered from the same site is a different problem entirely. The conservation process for iron recovered from long-term saltwater immersion requires years of controlled electrolytic treatment to draw the chloride ions out of the metal slowly enough that the object does not crack or fragment as it dries. A cannon that has survived 350 years on a seafloor can be destroyed in days by incorrect conservation practice. The chloride content of its corroded matrix causing catastrophic expansion as it dries in open air. The treatment tanks in which recovered cannon are stabilized run for years. The conservator's records for a single piece can run to thousands of entries. What the ocean preserved, it did not preserve easily for those who came after. The scale of what the 1622 hurricane destroyed across the full fleet is not easily held in the mind as a single thing. 8 ships lost. Approximately 550 lives recorded as lost, with the understanding that passenger and crew manifests of the period were not always perfectly accurate, that the figure is an estimate built from multiple documentary sources and is held with appropriate uncertainty by the historians who cite it. Gold and silver in quantities that the Spanish crown counted in the millions of ducats, representing a significant fraction of the annual revenue that the entire flota system was designed to deliver to Seville. Religious objects of the kind described in the cargo manifests, monstrances set with South American emeralds, reliquaries in their sealed ecclesiastical cases, sitting in the dark of the ocean floor in their Camera del Tesoro compartments, while the wooden walls of those compartments slowly dissolved around them. The theological dimension of that loss was not abstract to the Spanish crown or to the church institutions that had entrusted consecrated objects to the fleet's care. A monstrance, the ornate vessel used to display the consecrated host during Mass, was not, in the theology of 17th century Catholic Spain, simply a gold and jewel object of high monetary value. Its destruction or loss carried a different category of significance. The formal mourning observances that the loss of such objects could prompt at the Spanish court, and the commissioning of replacement pieces at royal expense, were not merely ceremonial gestures, they reflected a genuine understanding within the period's religious framework that something beyond material wealth had gone down with those ships. The gold bars in the bodega were a financial loss. The monstrance in the Camera del Tesoro was something else. That distinction does not appear in the colonial official records in any explicit form. The registro, the cargo manifest, listed the monstrance alongside the gold bars by weight and assessed value in the same careful handwriting on the same pages. The tazadores who valued the cargo for insurance purposes applied their standard per marco calculations to religious objects as they did to commercial bullion. The administrative machinery of the Casa de Contratación did not have a separate column for objects whose loss involved theological consequence, but the court records, the ecclesiastical correspondence, the accounts of what happened afterward in Seville, those show the distinction being drawn, the two kinds of loss being grieved differently, even if they were counted the same way on the manifest pages. The 5 survivors on the Atosha's mizzenmast would have known that distinction too. They clung to the mast through the dark, through the hours after the hurricane passed and the sea calmed. In the flat quiet that follows extreme weather on open water, a quiet that is itself a kind of disorientation, the sudden cessation of the overwhelming noise and force replaced by stillness, and the specific small sounds of water lapping against a single vertical structure. Below them, in 55 feet of water, the Atosha was settling. Its cargo was going through the first hours of its long redistribution on the sea floor. The iron cannon were dropping through whatever sediment existed at the impact point. The gold bars in the bodega were settling into the position they would maintain for the next 3.5 centuries. The watertight container with the duplicate cargo manifest, the sealed registro that had been kept in the captain's quarters, ready to be thrown overboard in case of capture, was somewhere in the dispersing wreck, its leather wrapping and cord binding, beginning the process of saltwater penetration that would eventually reach the paper inside. The record of what the ship carried was going the same way as what the ship carried. The mast itself would not stand indefinitely. Wood exposed above the waterline in the tropics, subject to sun and salt air, and the slow work of marine organisms at the waterline, has a limited useful life as a surface marker. Whether the 5 survivors were recovered before the mast failed, or whether the mast remained as a navigation hazard and then as a slowly sinking post for some period after their rescue, the record does not specify. What it specifies is that they survived. 5 people, from what the manifest had recorded as a fully loaded, heavily crewed treasure galleon carrying hundreds of souls through the Florida Straits in a September hurricane. The scale of the field of artifacts on the sea floor around the Atosha, 200 yards or more of scatter extending in the current's direction from the main hull mass, is one way of reading the scale of what was lost. Another way is the manifest itself, the hundreds of pages of the surviving registro in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, each chest numbered and described in the dense, careful handwriting of the colonial clerk who recorded it. Each numbered entry in that document corresponds to something that came to rest on the seafloor in the Florida Straits in September 1622. The ledger is the positive. The seafloor is the negative. Between the two of them, the Atocha is fully present, once in writing and once in the sand. The cannons that lay along the gun deck in their carriages during the crossing lay afterward along the seafloor in a line. The line of the gun deck's arrangement preserved in the new arrangement of objects on the bottom, the ship's geometry translated from vertical to horizontal, from the purposeful organization of a working vessel to the accidental but legible organization of a wreck site. The coral began its slow colonization of the iron surfaces within years of the sinking. Marine life organized itself around the structural remains, the hard surfaces of the corroding cannon and hull fittings, providing attachment points for organisms that would in turn attract others, the wreck site gradually becoming its own ecological feature, a hard-bottom community in otherwise sandy seafloor, a place where certain kinds of fish and invertebrate gathered because of what was there, the presence of the ship, rewriting the biological character of that particular patch of the Florida Straits bottom for centuries. The gold did not participate in any of that. It lay in the sand and did not change. It was gold when it left the assay house in Parací with its stamped weight notation and fineness mark. It was gold when it was loaded into the Atosha's bodega in Cartagena and chained to the inner hull frames. It was gold when the ship went down in September 1622. It was still gold with its assay marks intact when it was eventually lifted from the sand in the 20th century. 3.5 centuries at the bottom of the Florida Straits made no material difference to the gold bars themselves. The records that described them, the ship that carried them, the crew that guarded them, the empire that owned them, all of that had changed beyond recognition or ceased entirely. The gold was the same. That is the nature of the thing that went into the ocean with the Atosha. Not simply wealth, though it was certainly that, in quantities that the Spanish crown felt as a genuine fiscal wound. Not simply sacred objects, though they were that too, but also a particular quality of material permanence that the organic world, wood, rope, flesh, paper, does not possess. The hull planks dissolved, the rigging rotted, the manifest pages softened and dispersed. The gold bars held their shape, their weight, their stamped notations, their assessed fineness through every tide and current and seasonal temperature shift of 3.5 centuries of submersion in open Atlantic water. The ocean floor in the Florida Straits is a specific place. It has a particular quality of light at 55 feet, the filtered blue-green of shallow tropical Atlantic, enough sunlight penetrating to give the sand a kind of dim luminosity during the day, fading to complete darkness after sunset. The current moves through it. Sand shifts in small amounts with each tidal cycle, covering and uncovering edges of objects that have been sitting in the same position for generations. A gold bar lying at an angle in that sand, its stamped assay mark facing upward or downward depending on how it finally settled, in 1622, caught no light in the centuries before anyone came looking. It did not need to. It was not waiting in any purposeful sense. It was simply there, in the way that gold is simply there, in the specific place the storm put it, in the dark below the surface of the straits, in the cold and the stillness and the slow drift of the current above. The hurricane of 1622 is a documented event. Its date is established. The ships that sank are named in colonial records. The survivors were interviewed. The cargo manifests were filed in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, where they remained, available to anyone with the right credentials and the patience to read 17th century Spanish colonial hand for the full span of the centuries between the sinking and the recovery. The ocean preserved what the storm destroyed. The archive preserved what the ocean could not hold. Between the two of them, the record of the Atosha is more complete than the records of many events that occurred on dry land, in buildings, with witnesses, and what that record describes is a field of gold bars and silver coins and shattered ceramic and corroded iron lying in the sand of the Florida Straits in 55 feet of water, the whole scatter field extending outward in the direction the current runs. quiet and still, and exactly where the storm left it, in the dark below the surface, patient in the way that only objects without minds can be patient, holding the shape of everything that happened to them on a September morning in 1622, undisturbed in the long dark of the ocean floor, for as long as the ocean chose to keep them. In the reading room of the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, the light comes in through high stone windows and falls across the tables at a low angle in the afternoons. And a researcher named Eugene Leon sat in that light in the early 1970s with his hands on documents that were more than 300 years old. The building itself was constructed in the 16th century as a trading exchange, its stone floors worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, its tall shelves holding millions of pages of colonial administration, manifests, testimonies, correspondence, royal orders, the accumulated paperwork of an empire that recorded everything. Lyon was looking for the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, or rather for the documents that would tell him where to look for the Atocha, and he was doing it the only way it could be done, which was by reading page after page of faded brown ink in the careful cursive of Spanish colonial clerks, the handwriting of men who had never expected anyone to need these records quite so urgently, who had written them as routine administrative work and filed them and gone home to their suppers. What Lyon found, among the thousands of pages covering the events of September 1622, was a document that contained spatial information about the sinking, a reference to landmarks, a direction, a set of observations recorded by survivors and colonial officials in the days immediately following the disaster. The document had been in the archive for 3.5 centuries. It had not been lost exactly. It had simply been present, in its folder, in its numbered case, in its place on the shelf, waiting with the same patience that paper has always had. Leon noted the reference, copied the relevant passage in his careful scholar's handwriting, and the afternoon light moved across the reading room floor while he worked. That archival moment is where the second discovery of the Atocha began, not on the ocean floor, not with a salvage vessel and a magnetometer, but in a room in Seville with stone floors and high windows, with a researcher's hands moving across 400-year-old paper. The connection between a document in an archive and a wreck site on the ocean floor in Florida is not always obvious, but in this case it was a thread, and Eugene Lyon held one end of it, and on July 20th, 1985, the crew of Mel Fisher's salvage vessel Dauntless held the other. Mel Fisher had been searching for the Atocha for 16 years by the time the Dauntless located the main treasure deposit. 16 years is a long time to look for something that cannot move, and the record of that search is itself a document of patience and loss, not the loss of the ship, which had been lost for 3.5 centuries before Fisher began, but the loss of time, of money, of people who believed in the search and died before it concluded. Fisher's son Dirk and daughter-in-law Angel were among those who died during the search years, when their salvage vessel capsized in 1975. The record carries that fact plainly. The search continued. The main treasure deposit lay in 55 feet of water, approximately 41 miles west of Key West in the Florida Straits. The Dauntless located it not through luck or sudden revelation, but through the accumulation of prior work, years of surveying, of partial finds, of silver coins, and single gold bars turning up in the sand at intervals that gradually refined the search area. Leon's archival work had defined the region. Fisher's divers had worked it systematically for years, and the final discovery was what patient, methodical work tends eventually to produce, which is the thing it was looking for. The gold bars lay in the sand, in 55 feet of water. The emeralds lay nearby. The silver coins lay in a field that extended in the direction the current had carried them over 3.5 centuries of undisturbed settling. The legal question of who owned what, the Dauntless had found, was not settled by the discovery itself. Fisher had been in court over the Etosha's ownership for nearly a decade before July 1985, and the question had moved through multiple levels of the American judicial system with the deliberate slowness of any dispute that touches on fundamental questions of property, sovereignty, and the competing interests of a private individual and two levels of government. The state of Florida had made one set of claims, the federal government had made another. Fisher had contested both, on grounds that the Etosha lay beyond the 3-mile territorial limit, and therefore beyond the reach of either claimant under the law as it then stood. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the federal government's appeal in 1982, 3 years before the main deposit was found. That declination was itself a kind of ruling, an affirmation by the court's silence of the lower court's finding in Fisher's favor, and it established a precedent that would shape the legal landscape for private salvors operating in international waters. The case had not been about treasure in the abstract. It had been about a specific wreck in a specific location with specific coordinates, and about the question of who had the right to disturb it and take what it held. The court's effective answer in 1982 was that Fisher did. The gold bars and the emeralds and the silver coins in 55 feet of water in the Florida Straits were his to claim. Among the objects recovered from the Etosha's main deposit was a gold chalice set with 26 Colombian emeralds, fitted with a bezoar stone, a concretion from the stomach of an animal that physicians of the period believed would neutralize poison, which was why it was fitted to a chalice, so that if the cup were filled with something harmful, the stone would theoretically detect or counteract it. The chalice rests now in a display case in Key West, Florida, in a museum that Fisher established after the discovery. The gold is dark and warm under the museum lighting, the color that gold takes when it has spent centuries in salt water and been carefully conserved. The emeralds are each a different depth of green, some nearly transparent, some deep as harbor water, each one set in its individual mounting. The bezoar stone is fitted at the base where a person drinking would have held it. It is an object made for a world in which the possibility of being poisoned at a formal occasion was real enough to require a precaution, and the precaution was built into the cup, and the cup was placed on a ship, and the ship sank, and the cup lay in the sand for 363 years before anyone held it again. The Etosha's story has a conclusion of a kind, a wreck found, a court case won, a museum opened, objects conserved and displayed. Most of the Atlantic's treasure wrecks do not have that kind of conclusion. Most of them remain where they are, in various states of legal complexity, their positions known with varying degrees of certainty, their cargoes estimated from manifests and survivor accounts, and the long arithmetic of colonial trade records. The San Jose is the largest of the unresolved cases, and it has been unresolved for more than 3 centuries. The San Jose was a Spanish galleon of the First Order, a warship and a treasure carrier simultaneously, as the largest Spanish vessels of the early 18th century often were. On June 8, 1708, it was engaged by British naval vessels off the coast of Cartagena, Colombia, and it sank. The sinking was not caused by storm or reef, but by the concentrated fire of an opposing fleet, which places it in a different category than most treasure wrecks. Not a casualty of weather, but a casualty of war, with all the geopolitical complications that produces when the question of ownership is raised 3 centuries later. The San Jose was carrying what colonial records and subsequent analysis suggest was an enormous cargo approximately 11 million gold coins, plus emeralds and other gemstones from South American sources, plus silver bullion, plus the ordinary commercial freight of a vessel making the Atlantic crossing at the height of the colonial trade. These figures come from manifests and from the records of the colonial treasury in Cartagena, cross-referenced against the known production of South American mines in the period before the sailing. They are estimates, as all such figures at that distance must be, but they are estimates built on documentary foundations rather than legend. The Colombian government conducted an underwater robot survey of the San Jose site in 2015. The survey was successful in the sense that it produced information about the wreck's condition and location. It was also classified in a significant respect. The specific coordinates of the site were redacted from the publicly released report, making the survey simultaneously a public acknowledgement that the wreck had been located and a formal withholding of the information that would allow anyone else to go and look at it. The file containing the unredacted coordinates sits in a government archive in Bogota. The wreck itself sits in water off Cartagena at a depth that different reports have placed at various points between 600 and 900 meters, deep enough that no conventional salvage operation could reach it without specialized deep water equipment, but not beyond the reach of the kind of robotic systems that have been improving steadily since the survey was conducted. 3 parties have asserted some form of claim to the San Jose and its cargo. The Colombian government holds the position that the wreck lies in Colombian territorial waters or its exclusive economic zone and therefore falls under Colombian jurisdiction and ownership. The Spanish government holds the position that the San Jose was a warship of the Spanish crown and that warships under the international legal conventions that govern such matters retain the sovereign immunity of their flag nation in perpetuity, a principle that has been applied in other cases involving Spanish naval vessels and that Spain has argued consistently across multiple diplomatic and legal forums. A private salvage company, Sea Search Armada, claims to have identified the wreck's location decades before the Colombian government's 2015 survey, and to have a contractual entitlement to a portion of any recovered cargo under an agreement made with the Colombian government in the 1980s, an agreement whose terms and validity have been disputed in Colombian courts across several decades. The 3 positions do not overlap in any way that would allow a simple resolution. The file sits closed in Bogota. The wreck sits undisturbed in deep water off Cartagena. The San Jose situation is not unusual in its legal complexity, only in its scale. The principles in dispute, flag nation sovereignty over warships, coastal state jurisdiction over wrecks in territorial or economic waters, the rights of private salvors under prior contractual arrangements, are contested in almost every significant treasure wreck case that moves toward excavation or recovery. They are contested not because the law is deliberately unclear, but because the law was written to handle contemporary situations and is being applied to objects and events that predate it by centuries. A Spanish galleon, commissioned by the Habsburg crown and sunk by British naval fire in 1708, was not anticipated in any of the international maritime conventions that have since been drafted, and fitting it into those conventions requires interpretation. And interpretation requires courts and governments and time. The Merchant Royal occupies a different position in the record, a vessel whose sinking is documented, whose cargo is described in contemporary accounts, and whose location remains genuinely unestablished. It was an English merchant vessel that sank in the Bay of Biscay in September 1641, reportedly carrying a cargo of gold and silver of substantial weight including a large quantity of pieces of eight that it had been carrying on behalf of the Spanish government. The sinking is recorded in contemporary sources. The scale of the cargo is attested in accounts written close to the time of the loss. What is not established is where the ship is. The Merchant Royal has been claimed as located by multiple salvage companies over the past 3 decades. None of these claims has been publicly verified through the production of coordinates confirmed against physical evidence from the seafloor. The wreck has been announced as found and then found again, and then found a third time, each announcement generating attention and then gradually retreating into ambiguity when the follow-through that verification would require did not materialize. This pattern, the announcement, the attention, the absence of confirmation, has made the Merchant Royal one of the most frequently misidentified wrecks in Atlantic treasure history. A designation that says something about the difficulty of deep water identification as much as it says about the specific vessels involved. The Bay of Biscay is deep and cold, and its floor is wide. Side-scan sonar returns a great deal of acoustic data that requires interpretation, and interpretation can be mistaken, and the wish to have found something particular can influence how an ambiguous return is read. The tools that contemporary underwater archaeology and salvage operations use to find and document wrecks are considerably more capable than anything available to Mel Fisher when he began his search for the Ataka in the 1960s. Side-scan sonar generates acoustic images of the seafloor by emitting sound pulses and recording how they reflect from objects below, producing the ghostly shadow images that show up on a screen aboard a research vessel as darker shapes against lighter background, the outlines of a hull's main structural mass, or the scatter pattern of a debris field readable in the acoustic data if the analyst is experienced and the wreck is large enough to register clearly. Multi-beam bathymetry builds three-dimensional maps of the seafloor with enough resolution to distinguish the profile of an iron cannon from the profile of a natural rock formation at significant depths. Sub-bottom profilers send lower frequency pulses through the sediment itself, returning information about what is buried beneath the seafloor surface rather than only what is resting on it, which matters for treasure wrecks because the heaviest objects, the gold bars and the iron cannon shot, often settle into the sediment over centuries and are not visible on the surface at all. These instruments do not find wrecks. They produce data from which experienced analysts can infer the presence of wrecks, and then fieldwork, sending a remotely operated vehicle down or in accessible depths a diver, confirms or does not confirm what the data suggested. The confirmation requires physical evidence, the specific shape of a ship's timber, the profile of a period-appropriate cannon, the characteristic scatter pattern of ceramic cargo containers called olive jars that appear in nearly every Spanish colonial wreck. Without physical confirmation, a sonar shadow is a sonar shadow. The Bay of Biscay has many sonar shadows. Most of them are rocks. When physical confirmation does occur and objects are brought to the surface, they enter a conservation process that the word slow does not quite capture. Metal objects from a marine environment have spent decades or centuries in salt water, and the salt has penetrated into the structure of the metal at the molecular level. Iron objects from a shipwreck are not iron anymore in any simple sense. They are iron that has been partially replaced by mineral compounds held together by the matrix of corrosion, and sometimes by the concretions of biological material that have grown around them over the centuries. A cannon from a 17th century wreck, when it is brought to the surface and exposed to air, is in danger of fragmenting or collapsing as the moisture within it evaporates and the corrosion compounds that were stable underwater become unstable in air. Conservation begins immediately upon recovery, and for significant iron objects, it may continue for years, the object kept in controlled conditions, subjected to chemical baths that slowly extract the chloride ions that cause post-recovery deterioration, monitored constantly, its progress assessed through regular sampling. Gold objects are more stable. Gold does not corrode in the way that iron does, and a gold bar that has spent 3 centuries in salt water may emerge in better physical condition than iron objects recovered from the same wreck. But gold objects still require documentation, analysis, and careful handling. The assay marks stamped into colonial gold bars before loading were made with specific tools in specific assay houses, and the marks are evidence of where the gold was processed, evidence of its certified purity, evidence of the administrative chain that connected a mine in South America to a chest in a ship's hold, to a bar now resting on a conservation table in a museum laboratory. Reading those marks correctly requires expertise, and the expertise requires that the marks be preserved intact, which requires that the conservation be done carefully. Everything in the process takes time. The Archivo General de Indias in Seville holds approximately 9 kilometers of documents when measured by shelf length, a figure that requires a moment to let settle. 9 kilometers of paper from the colonial administration of an empire that lasted more than 3 centuries. Within those 9 kilometers are the records of every treasure fleet that made the Atlantic crossing during the period of the Fluta system, or rather the records of every fleet whose paperwork survived fire, water, political disruption, and simple administrative neglect, having removed some portion of the original documentation over the centuries. What survives is extensive. A researcher arriving at the Archivo today can order documents from the relevant legajos, the bound document bundles organized by administrative category and date, and sit in the reading room under the high windows and read the same pages that Eugene Lyon read, in the same building with the same afternoon light coming in at the same angle. The handwriting is still careful. The ink is still brown and faded. The clerks who wrote those pages are gone, but the pages are there. The 1622 fleet manifest that Lyon identified, the registro that described the Atosha's cargo and provided the spatial observations that eventually contributed to the location of the main deposit, is one document among thousands covering the events of that September. There are survivor testimonies taken in Havana in the days after the storm, in which men described what they had experienced on the deck of a ship in a hurricane before dawn. There are administrative reports from colonial officials in Havana and Cartagena describing the scale of the loss. There are the records of the Spanish crown's immediate salvage attempts in the weeks and months following the sinking, the Zabra dive boats anchored over the site, the indigenous free divers descending through clear shallow water toward the outline of a hull on the seafloor, and the partial recoveries, and the frustrations and the eventual abandonment when a second hurricane came and moved the debris field, burying much of it under fresh sand and making the site unreachable. All of that paperwork is in Seville. All of it survived. There is something in the survival of those documents that does not have an obvious name. The Atocha sank. The cargo of gold and silver and emeralds and sacred objects went to the bottom of the Florida Straits. The registered copies of the manifest, the administrative correspondence, the survivor testimonies, these persisted in their archive, accumulating slowly into the body of evidence that Eugene Lyon read through in the early 1970s. The object survived, and the paper survived, and the paper eventually led back to the object. The connection between them held across 3.5 centuries, not because anyone maintained it intentionally, but because both the archive and the seafloor are in their different ways good at keeping things. The Atosha chalice in its display case in Key West represents the recovered portion of this story, the part that came back up, that was conserved and documented and placed under glass for people to look at. Its 26 Colombian emeralds and its bezoar stone and its dark gold are present in the world again, visible, measurable, held in a building where a person can stand and look at them on a Tuesday afternoon. The manifest pages in the Archivo General de Indias are present in the world in a different way, accessible but not displayed, requiring a researcher's intent and a reading room table and hours of careful attention before they yield what they contain. And then there are the portions of the story that are neither displayed nor accessible, the things that remain in the sediment or in the deep water or in the redacted coordinates of a classified government survey. And those portions are simply present in the world in yet another way, which is the way of things that exist but are not yet known in their particulars. The San Jose's 11 million gold coins and its emeralds are in the water off Cartagena. The file that knows precisely where they are sits in a government archive in Bogota with its relevant pages closed. The depth of the water above the wreck makes it unreachable by any diver and reachable only by the kind of robotic deep-water vehicle that the Colombian government used in 2015 and that private interests with sufficient resources could also deploy if the legal questions were ever resolved in a way that permitted it. The legal questions have not been resolved. The wreck has not been disturbed. The coins and the emeralds have been in the deep water for more than 300 years without being touched, and the deep water is cold and dark and very still at that depth, and the pressure at that depth is considerable, and the current at that depth is slow, and things left there tend to remain where they were left. There is a kind of patience in the deep ocean that has nothing to do with waiting. The things on the seafloor are not waiting. They are simply there, as they have always been, in the condition that centuries of cold water have produced in them. The gold is still gold. The emeralds are still emeralds, their color unchanged by time, because color in a gemstone is a property of its crystal structure, and crystal structures do not decay. The cannon that sank with the San Jose when British naval fire opened its hull in June of 1708 are still resting where they came to rest, their bronze dark and their iron corroded into the mineral forms that centuries of salt water produces, but still there, still holding roughly the shape they held when they were cast in the foundries of the Spanish crown. The ship's structure has long since given way to the pressure and the biology of the deep ocean, but the heaviest objects persist, as they always do, as the sounding continues to show when the sonar returns its acoustic image of a shape that was once a hull. The Bay of Biscay in autumn is gray and cold, its surface marked by the long swells that come in off the Atlantic and by the shorter, steeper waves that build where those swells meet. Shallower water near the continental margin. The Merchant Royal sank somewhere in that water in September 1641, and the water has been there ever since, going about its ordinary Atlantic business, and the Merchant Royal has been there too, in whatever state 3.5 centuries of deep water leave an English merchant vessel of that period. The sonar images that various salvage companies have produced over the past 30 years may include an image of the Merchant Royal, or they may not. The wreck is somewhere. The coordinates of that somewhere have not been established to the standard that verification requires. The Bay of Biscay is wide and deep and does not yield its inventory readily. The reading room of the Archivo General de Indias is still there. The high stone windows still admit the afternoon light at the same angle they always have.